Okay, welcome back everyone. Our first speaker this morning is Christoph Hoerl from Warwick, who's going to be speaking to us on do we need a phenomenology of passage. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks very much, Hugh. So after a foray into psychology yesterday afternoon, we're back with philosophy, but I'm not a metaphysician and I'm certainly not a philosopher of science or especially of physics. I'm a philosopher of mind, and I want to talk about ways in which the debate, or one particular way in which the debate on passage has kind of intersected with issues in the philosophy of mind. But I thought, after listening to some of the previous talks, that to start off with, I give you kind of my picture of what the debate on passage looks like from where I'm standing, those particular bits where people have tried to hook up the debate on passage with issues in the philosophy of mind. So this is how things look like from my end of the telescope, as it were, an opinionated guide to the debate about passage from the philosophy of mind corner. There's one sort of argument that you find in the literature that in favour of the idea of passage, that starts with the idea that you can't reduce tense beliefs, such as the meeting begins now, to tenseless beliefs. And people have tried to infer from that that tense beliefs are about something different than tenseless beliefs. And I think the typical response involving people such as John Parry and so to that has been that we can actually explain the difference between tense beliefs and tenseless beliefs quite easily without bringing in the idea that they're beliefs about different things. Rather, the difference between them lies in the different cognitive roles that those types of beliefs play. So by and large, I think people from where I'm standing think that this debate has come and gone. This is not really a live debate anymore. But then there's been another sort of debate where people have argued in favour of passage from the phenomenology of experience broadly conceived, where what I mean by that is from the phenomenological differences between anticipation, direct experience, and memory. And the one key example here is Arthur Pryor's thank goodness argument. Pryor saying, think about the impending root canal that you anticipate with fear, and then you undergo that very painful experience, and after it's happened, you say, thank goodness that's over. This change in your attitude towards the event seems to indicate that time has passed. You're not just thinking of that event as one event stuck at a location in time forever. But again, I think people think that that debate has come and gone by and large. Again, the idea is that there's some sort of indexical fallacy that people commit who think that shows us anything about the reality of passage. Again, the idea is that we're confusing different ways of thinking about things with different things thought about. And there are some extra arguments that have come up recently. Craig Callender has just published a paper saying we can actually, part of what explains our difference in attitude towards the future versus the past has to do with evolutionary considerations. If you take yourself to be able to do something about the future, then that might explain why you anticipate the root canal with fear, whereas if you take yourself to be unable to do anything about the past, then that sort of attitude towards the root canal once it's in your past doesn't really make evolutionary sense anymore. Again, I think think of this as kind of one of these mobile phones that were as thick as bricks in the 80s and 90s. People think that it has that sort of feel about it. That debate is no longer current. And I think here we come to the iPhone version of the debate that's really cropped up mostly fairly recently, where people have tried to argue in one way or another for the reality of passage from the phenomenology of experience narrowly conceived as perceptual experience, direct perceptual experience, specifically direct perceptual experience of movement and change. And as an illustration here, there's a quote from Robin Lepedwin, for instance, who says, "We're not only aware of the passage of time when we reflect on our memories of what has happened, we're not just aware in the way that Pryor is talking about with the thank goodness argument, we just see time passing in front of us, in the movement of a second hand around the clock, or the falling of sand through an hourglass, or indeed any motion or change at all." And this idea that there's a phenomenology of passage involved in perceptual experiences of movement and change, you can find in a number of recent publications. Laurie Paul has an article in the Journal of Philosophy, for instance, talking about that, which I will go into in more detail as we go along. John Norton has an argument along those lines. Barry Dainton as well recently has spoken of, or actually for quite a while has spoken of perceptual experience of movement and changes involving a dynamic phenomenology, a phenomenology of passage. So that's really the version of the argument that I want to talk about today. But before I start, I should just briefly explain what I will mean by passage, or how I conceive of the debate about passage in what follows. Roughly speaking, you can distinguish between a reductionist view of movement and change, where the claim is that all there is to things moving or changing over time simply is for those things to occupy different spatial locations or to have different intrinsic properties of suitable kinds at different times. With respect to movement in particular, this sort of theory is sometimes called an at theory. So a thing is moving if it's at different positions at different times, and that's all there is to movement. But then there's the anti-reductionist about movement and change who says, actually, you're missing something out here. In order to get right the nature of time, you have to acknowledge that times themselves, or things as they are at a time, also undergo a further sui generis form of motion or change. And that's where the idea of passage comes in. They pass or flow from the future through the present into the past. So that's the way I want to conceive of the debate about passage in what follows, as a debate between a certain type of reductionist and a certain type of anti-reductionist. So I said that recently there's been a number of people who've said that there is a phenomenology of passage associated with experiences of movement and change. So the idea is that those perceptual experiences at least seem to present us with passage as the anti-reductionist conceives of it. And actually that claim about the phenomenology of passage is typically agreed upon both by reductionists and anti-reductionists, insofar as they talk specifically about perceptual experiences of movement and change. So both reductionists and anti-reductionists typically agree that it seems to us in perceptual experience that we are directly confronted with passage. Where they disagree is simply as to whether that element of perceptual experience is veridical, as I think John Norton would might say, or whether that element of the phenomenology of experience is an illusion, which is the line that Laurie Paul and Barry Dainton, for instance, are running. The second form of response, exemplified by Paul and Dainton, you could also call an error theory regarding temporal, that particular feature of temporal experience. And what I want to do, the way I want to approach this debate is by looking in particular at this type of error theory regarding temporal experience. And what I want to suggest is that it actually is the wrong sort of response to make to the anti-reductionist, and actually the right sort of response, if you are a reductionist here, should be to disagree on the supposed phenomenological datum So the right response, if you're a reductionist, should be to simply deny that there is a phenomenology of passage associated with experiences of movement and change. So an arrow theorist regarding temporal experience, as I conceive of him or her, will say, we do seem to perceive passage, but there's in fact no such thing. Now, if you think about it, if passage is meant to be this sort of sui generis form of motion or change that times or things in time are meant to undergo, there is something dialectically slightly awkward about the arrow theorist's position. If there is really no such thing as the property of undergoing passage, how can we actually have any idea of what it would even be for there to be perceptual illusions as of something having that property? I think this is a version of a problem, of a generic problem with arrow theories that has been highlighted in other forms of arrow theory by Barry Stroud, for instance. And of course, so far that's a very vague way of putting the worry, but what I want to do is look at the particular way in which I think the writers that I've mentioned before try to address this worry and say that they're not successful in addressing it. And I think the way, implicitly at least, they try to address this worry is by way of an appeal to a particular sort of psychological phenomenon, namely the phenomenon of apparent motion. That figures both, for instance, in Dainton and in Laurie Paul. And I have to apologize to Alex here because this is as far as my kind of computing skills will take me. This is a very simple way of trying to produce the apparent motion experience. Studied since Exner's and Wertheimer's time, the idea here is that there's a particular sort of perceptual illusion where you're presented with two stimuli at two separate places, and in this particular version, which is sometimes called color-phi, those two stimuli are colored differently. And even though all you see are those two differently colored stimuli at two different places, what's actually generated is an impression of movement from the location of the first stimulus to the location of the second stimulus, and also, which this doesn't really help make vivid, supposedly an abrupt change in color midway between the location of the first stimulus and the second stimulus. That's a specific feature about making the color of the two different stimuli different. If you make the shape different, for instance, then you get a plastic transformation from the shape of the first stimulus to the appearance of the plastic transformation of the shape of the first stimulus to the second stimulus. And I think Laurie Paul thinks that appealing to this sort of, and Barry Dainton as well, appealing to this sort of psychological phenomena helps us see how an arrow theory about temporal experiences could be correct, how it could be that we are seemingly presented with passage in perceptual experience, but that turns out to be a mere illusion. Here's a quote from her paper. In color-phi, she says, the brain represents the situation as though there is an animated qualitative change in a dot from red to green, and this representation is as of an animated qualitative change that is no different in character from other sorts of visual experiences as of change that we normally have as part of our everyday experience. The take-home message here is that the color-phi experiment gives us the illusion of the animated character of qualitative color change. Now, I think this is possibly a way of unpacking the argument that she wants to make here. So, the phenomenology of movement and change experienced in cases of color-phi clearly involves an illusion. I think this is agreed upon on all sides. And she thinks that the same phenomenology is also present in experiences we have when we look at things that are actually moving or changing, or both. Now we move on from there to the idea that we aren't aware, in the case of colour-phi, that all we're presented with are two differently coloured static stimuli exposed at two different times. And just in the same way, supposedly we're not aware, in a case in which we see a real object moving and changing colour, that all we're in fact presented with is the object occupying different locations and having different colours at different times. So in each case, the idea is that instead we have some sort of illusory experience as of the motion or change having an extra special animated character where that corresponds to the anti-reductionist idea of passage. So this argument is supposed to explain on psychological grounds how the supposed illusion of passage is created by your visual system. We can see that colour-phi obviously involves an illusion. We think that there is movement there, and in fact there are only two static stimuli. But Paul thinks exactly the same type of illusion is going on when we're actually looking at a moving object.
Could I ask you, what is meant by animated?
Well, that's the phrase that Paul uses, and I think the way she uses it is to say it's that character, that feature of the phenomenology of the experience that goes beyond supposedly just experiencing the object occupying different positions in space or having different colours. That there's some extra thing which then supposedly corresponds to the idea of passage. It's because we experience the movement in a different way, in this animated way, that we come to think of it as involving the apparent presentation of passage. Is that? I think you may already be inclined to think something quite similar to what I'm going to ask.
Maybe this is also some, since yours says what is meant by animated, I want to ask what is meant by illusion. Since in the first case, it's clear what it means. There was not actually a succession of intermediate images.
I think if you allow me, I think you may be the better phenomenologists here than the people I've been talking about. I think you're on my side, basically, but I think then there's a wiggle that we still need to sort out. I think there is a problem here with this argument. I said before, the issue here is to do with the dialectical problem that the arrow theorist faces, to make intelligible how, if there is no such thing as passage, there can nevertheless be an illusion of passage. And I think the problem with the argument that I've just presented comes down to this. If you're a reductionist, then you already have all the means available to say what the contrast between appearance and reality consists in the case of colour-phi. So this is the kind of thing that the reductionist could say about the case of colour-phi, where there obviously is an illusion. So they might say that it appears that there is a continuous locational variation across time, where in fact there are only just two stimuli at two discrete locations.
Two discrete locations at different times?
At different times, yes. It also appears, you might think, that one colour is directly, without interruption, immediately succeeded by another. In fact, there's both a temporal and spatial gap. And again, they might say there appears to be one persisting object undergoing variation in location and colour. In fact, there are only two brief stationary stimuli. All of that can be said without going outside the vocabulary of the reductionist. But then it seems you're facing the following issue. We can give an account of what the difference between appearance and reality in colour-phi consists in. That's couched entirely in the vocabulary of the reductionist. none of the differences between appearance and reality mentioned in that account are present when we look at an object that's actually moving and changing colour. When you have an object that's actually moving and changing in colour, you do have, or let's suppose that you do have continuity, you do have an abrupt, immediate change in colour, and you do have one persisting object, and so on and so forth. So it looks like the example of colourify is simply of no help in giving substance to the idea that there is an illusory element of passage, also present in perceptions of actual movement and change. Was that the intuition that you had? So you're on my side here, I think. But I think there's a stubborn thing about many philosophers of mind that they won't give in at this point. They will just say, well, hang on, I know what it's like for me. I mean, obviously you have that in discussions of consciousness and qualia as well. They will say, I know what the phenomenology of my experience is like, and you haven't accounted for it properly yet. You haven't, there's this thing that I'm directly aware of through experience, or seem to be directly aware of through experience, that you haven't accounted for as yet. So here's one reason, for, one way of putting the kind of work that still remains to be done. Yeah.
Would this answer? I mean, why couldn't you object that when in the example there's the green dot and the red dot, from this point of view, there's still passage, still experiences change and movement, also a slightly different form of movement. So there isn't really any. What I fail to see is a substantial difference as far as this discussion is concerned between a continuous shift and so that both experience can be interpreted, can be referred in both languages, with and without.
Again, I think you'll find that I'm on your side as we go along.
Do you mean neither is illusory?
Either illusory or both are illusory. Yeah. But I don't see the difference. I don't think it's.
Well, both are experiences of change. There may nevertheless be an illusory element in apparent motion that doesn't have to do with the fact just that it's an impression of change. But I think at this, so the dialectical point that we've arrived at is that I've suggested that what the reductionist should say is there simply is no phenomenology of passage involved in perceptual experiences of movement and change. But so the original form of error theory about temporal experience that we've looked at is wrong, because there isn't any error involved in experiencing movement and change. But now, of course, we've ended up with a different form of error theory. There are these kind of very clever and otherwise very admirable philosophers who do say, well, that's what it feels like for me. And what we now want to argue is, well, whilst it may seem to some philosophers or some people that there is such a thing as an illusory phenomenology of passage in experiences of movement and change, there is in fact no such thing. So we have another form of error theory here, namely that there are people who are under what you could call a cognitive illusion, that their experiences are a certain way, where as a matter of fact the experiences themselves are not that way. And that can seem to be quite a puzzling claim to make about somebody else's experiences. You think your experiences are that way, but as a matter of fact, you have no idea what your experiences are actually like. So I think what's called for here is some form of diagnosis. There has to be something, some genuine feature of experiences of movement and change that these people identify, that they have a genuine insight about, but nevertheless they get it wrong about what exactly that feature is. by describing it as the feature of it being an illusion of passage. And what I want to finish with is a suggestion as to how we could identify that aspect of our experiences of movement and change that people might misattribute by saying, actually, it feels to me like I'm directly presented with instances of passage. And here's the sketch of what I'm going to suggest, and then I'm going to try and fill it out in slightly more detail. As we've seen, and as Carlo has actually pressed exactly that point, there are a number of different distinctions that we can draw between different sorts of temporal phenomena that we can, in favourable circumstances, directly encounter in perception. So, we can, for instance, see abrupt changes versus gradual ones. So Carlo has said, actually, when I see the red dot and then the green dot, that's still a change. The green dot succeeds the red dot, and I can see that. Only that change doesn't have certain features that other changes have. Like, it's not a continuous change, for instance. It's not a gradual change. It's not a change that involves a persisting object. It's a discontinuous change, and so on and so forth. But those are all distinctions we can draw between different sorts of temporal phenomena that, if we're lucky, we can directly make out in perceptual experience. But then there's a further distinction that hasn't really been taken heed of so far, which is that there are certain temporal phenomena that we can perceive directly, and other phenomena that we simply can't perceive directly. And my suggestion will be that if you have the idea that you have a phenomenology of passage, that when you look at moving objects or things changing colour and you see that directly, there's this kind of je ne sais quoi to your experience that's meant to indicate that you're seemingly perceiving passage. What you're actually doing is that you're confusing these two types of distinction with one another. So let me try to convince you of that by having a closer look at this second type of distinction. Here we have another instance of people quoting C.D. Broad in some of his other writings. He's talking about the experience of movement and change. And this is a very famous quote where he says, it's a notorious fact that we don't merely notice that something has moved or otherwise changed. We often see something moving or changing. This happens if we look at the second hand of a watch or look at a flickering flame. It's clear that to see a second hand moving is a quite different thing from seeing, as it were, that an hour hand has moved. So there's a phenomenological difference between looking at the second hand and looking at the hour hand. Both are moving, but in one case you can see the movement, in the other case you can't see the movement. Here is another similar point being made by Russell, this time not with respect to movement, but with respect to change of colour. Suppose we're watching a chameleon gradually changing. We may be quite unable to see a process of change, and yet able to know that after a time a change has taken place. This will occur if, supposing A and B to be the shades at the beginning, at the end of a species present, A and B are indistinguishable, while A recollected is distinguishable from C when C occurs. So the idea is that there are some movement or changes which are simply too slow to be perceived by us. And I think we have a similar idea, explanatory idea, in the background in both Russell and Broad as to how that's to be explained, that only some changes can be perceived and others can't. Namely, the idea is that there is something like a maximum interval of time, which is often referred to as the species present, that individual experiences can span. And in order for a change to be perceivable, the situation at the end of that interval must be perceptually discriminable by you from the situation at the beginning of the interval. Otherwise, no matter how long you look all you will have is a succession of discrete experiences, none of which is an experience of change. You can stare at the hour hand for as long as you want, you won't see it moving. And that's because each individual experience you have while you're doing so only lasts a short period of time. And during that period of time, the hour hand doesn't move enough for you to discriminate its position from at the beginning of that interval from the position at the end of that interval. So this idea that there's a maximum interval of time that individual experiences can span is currently kind of articulated in different ways in different sorts of theories of temporal experiences. So they're sometimes distinguished, the key ones are sometimes distinguished as intentionalism versus extensionalism, or retentionalism versus extensionalism. What I'm saying is neutral between those two forms of spelling out the nature of temporal experiences. So Rick Rush, for instance, thinks that perception involves representational states that can cover an interval of time. As he puts it, the perceptual system interprets the represented system in terms of trajectories or processes. These form, so to speak, the basic vocabulary of the perceptual system. So the perceptual system doesn't just present things as they are at one moment in time, but as they go on for a certain interval of time. A different way of articulating that notion of the species present you find in an extensionalist such as Dainton, who says we can perceive movement and change because our perceptual experiences themselves extend through a period of clock time. As he puts it, our episodes of experiencing are themselves temporally extended and are thus able to incorporate change and persistence in quite a straightforward way. So what I'm suggesting is that that particular idea of a structural difference in the of a structural feature of the phenomenology of movement and change, that you can only see certain movements and changes and can't see others, even though they're taking place right in front of you, due to the fact that experiences can only span a certain limited interval of time. That's what the writers that we had before confused with the idea of a difference in the content of experiences that seemingly present us with passage versus others that don't.
Yeah, I don't know if it matters for your argument, but these people are also all wrong about motion mechanisms and how motion percepts work, which may be, in fact, so for example, so our motion mechanisms are many different integration times, different aspects of our motion perception have different integration times that don't correspond to the species present. That when people try to give a single number for a species present, it actually doesn't correspond to the same time that we can
Got different
motion.
modalities.
It's hard to different motion systems for based on luminance change can have short integration intervals, whereas for ones that respond to contrast would have longer integration intervals. But whatever they are, there's not a monolithic system that corresponds to a species present. It's not the case that you can unify everything so that you can say that we can say whether or not you'll be able to experience motion based on whether if you put A and B next to each other they're distinguishable or not.
Right.
Because it's actually the motion system that's separate from your conscious ability to distinguish between two appearances of something when they're not joined together. Motion versus determines whether you perceive motion. So I think it's actually just a whole other interesting area of illusion, cognitive illusion that these people have, that they're going to assume that the species present is a single interval, and if the two position stations of the apparent motion go beyond that interval, that we won't be able to experience motion. That's what determines it. And then we have to have a whole theory of why we think we have a species present, even though if you look at all the individual mechanisms of the system, they're not.
I've only got one slide left. Maybe, if it's okay, we can just come back to that in the discussion. So this is basically what I've tried to argue. So, as we've just seen, sometimes all we have are experiences of an object occupying different locations or having different colors. at different times, without us ever actually perceiving the object moving or changing. Think of the hour hand example here. But it's a mistake to conclude from that that experiences in which we do perceive an object moving or changing colour must involve something else being apparently present in experience, in addition to the object occupying different locations or having different colours at different times. Instead, the explanation of the difference as to why we sometimes see the change and sometimes we don't is to be sought in the basic thought of a difference between an experience of succession and a mere succession of experiences, as William James or Edmund Husserl would have put it. Okay, thanks. That's it.
Thank you, Christoph. David first. Could the rest of you please keep your hands up so I can make a list?
So I have two questions if I can. One that's smaller and one a little larger. The smaller one is, I'm not sure where, so it seems completely, maybe this is just a question of wording. It seems like the place you're ending up is a place that would be fairly characterized as saying there's a distinctive experience of change. There's something extra in the phenomenology when the change is occurring over a sufficiently short time period that isn't present in the phenomenology in the case of just a succession of experiences.
Yeah.
But so maybe this is just a question of wording, but that sounds like a straightforward denial of what you were saying in the beginning of the talk, that the way to approach this is to deny that there's any phenomenological difference. It sounds like you're ending up granting that there's a phenomenological difference, but a difference that can be explained in a perfectly, ad way. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, I don't see it that way, because I think that people I'm arguing against would say that you can have, let's think of it as somebody who says that perceptual experience has content.
Right.
And they would say that you can have perceptual experiences which either have a content that presents just things being at different places at different times, or it has a content that's something extra.
But you're not denying that the phenomenon, that the character of the experience is
No,
different.
because this is it's the difference between having the experience and not having it.
Good. The second question, which I guess is more
David,
important.
I've done an extremely long list.
It's really quick, though.
Okay, I'm timing it. You've got
Okay,
90 seconds.
here it is really quickly. The bigger issue for me while I was sitting here was it seems like the phenomenal experience that's being dealt with is being limited in a way that seems to me artificial and maybe constraining to things like visual or direct sensual experience. That is, here's another aspect that people would say is part of the phenomenal experience of passage. You can take it. New things are constantly being settled. Possibilities are constantly being foreclosed, okay? That's clearly not a visual experience, a direct visual experience, or a direct sensory experience, but probably would be widely identified as a deep part of whatever somebody's going to point at when they're talking about the phenomenology of passing.
I think that was part of why I started off the way I did, because I think I think you're absolutely right that if you talk about the phenomenology of temporal experience, you can conceive of experience in a very broad way that brings in anticipation, memory, that brings in the kind of epistemic differences that you were talking about, and so on. But you can also talk about it in a very narrowly constrained way, but a perceptual experience narrowly constrained.
But somebody might say,
David,
and I think there's an important point about the debate here, because I think the danger very often lies in this kind of bait and switch tactic that people say, look at look at this experience,
Right.
you haven't accounted for that.
Right.
And then you say, well, I'm giving you an account of that.
Right.
And then they say, yeah, but that doesn't bring in the fact
Right.
that you also have this broader
Right.
experience.
Right.
And I think that should be resisted.
Okay, as I said, I've got a very long list. Please try to be terse. Chris?
Yes, I'm just trying to think, just talking about spatial motion for the time being. I'm trying to think how an at theory accounts for the findings that Kia was talking about yesterday, about the way in which we anticipate, our perception involves anticipation of the continuity of the trajectory of moving objects, and which we also know is actually present very early in infancy. So it does seem that the psychology of perception involves at least path or trajectory. Okay, one other thing, and that is that if we think also about evidence from language and the kind of things that language renders salient, there do seem to be, as well as the movement of a particular thing which is on a trajectory against the background, there is also the movement with respect to each other of the parts of that object. So we do actually, we do talk about the difference between running and walking, for example.
Yes.
So how do those fit into? How could those fit into a sort of
Well,
account?
okay, so on the first point, I think...
And I'm not asking about time here,
Yeah.
I'm talking about spatial motion.
So, but motion involves variation over time.
It does.
Yeah. It is actually an important part of all big things. It's an important part of his theory that those representational states that we have in perception actually have an anticipatory element in them. They cover both an interval of time that lies in the past with respect to when the representation is generated, as well as an interval in the future, and that's how he wants to explain, for instance, things like the flashback illusion or apparent motion. I disagree on that, but you can bring on that account, you can bring anticipation in there. I would say, with respect to, obviously, running and walking involve different sorts of movement, but what I've been trying to press is that those distinctions that you might make between different sorts of movement which can be perceived, but the person whom I've called the reductionist, they've got enough vocabulary in their arsenal to really describe all of them. Walking is like the positions don't succeed each other as quickly as when you're running, for instance, and so on and so forth. You don't have to bring in some extra bit that would force you to talk about passage or any of these things.
Okay, Chris, I'm sorry, I'm going to be, I'm going to cut people off here in order to try and get through the list. Sam, you're next.
So early on you said that the claim being made by your target, who you're trying to argue against, is that perceptual experience of motion and change has this extra flowy feature. I don't think their claim is more general than that. I think they think that all experience has this kind of flowy character.
Yes.
And maybe what they're saying can be cast in terms of phenomenal consciousness. What it's like to experience the world is to have an experience of flow. It kind of comes apart from motion change.
Yes. I think that goes back to the bait and switch aspect of the debate that I was mentioning to Albert. I think so. I've tried to pin down one particular way of arguing for phenomenology in the passage that's to do with the content of perceptual experiences of movement and change. If you then say, yeah, but that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the experience of passage, there's a presence of experience that any experience that I have has this aspect to it that it's experience is happening in the present or so. Obviously, that would demand another argument against it. one potential argument here is that if we want to talk about experience, if you want to talk about the content of experience in the first place, you want to talk about something that experience can either have or lack. And if you say every experience has this particular content attached to it, that is happening in the present, then I'm not sure what sort of accuracy or verifiability tradition are we talking about here? We can't lack that. That would be just
One
Nick,
thing.
no, I'm sorry, Raphael, no, my queue is so long. I'm not going to like it. I will put you on the end of the queue. Nick.
So I'm really sympathetic to this, but it seems to me both of these kind of responses concede something that really shouldn't be conceded, that they still basically have built into them this picture that when we're thinking about perception, you have to sort of think of it as extracting something from a bunch of spatially located things and an instant. Why does it have to be like that? Why shouldn't perception, this is the way I sort of think of it, things don't just come labeled with sort of where they are, they come with something like a velocity vector associated on them. And let me finish up and say a bit more about this. And that's really what you should be getting from the phi experiments. And what they show, demonstrate is the existence in the visual system of very low level motion detectors. Right? These are built into the retina in the first stages of it. Right? And what's happening is it's nothing to do with this is not the right way to think about it. We have motion detectors that will tell you not only where things are, but how they are moving at any time. And that is just part of, approximating away from sort of some sort of species present. That's just part of the instantaneous perception we have. It's nothing to do with this having extended perceptions or anything.
I think that, again, that takes us off into other areas. I've actually, to a certain extent, quite sympathetic.
But it's totally right. We don't have anything, they're not picking up spatial variation, they're picking up temporal variation. So of course we experience motion as different from, say, spatial variation.
I think I would go along with you to some extent as far as that as an account of the colour phi experiment is concerned. Because the striking, I set aside here something that, or I said some things that I don't actually believe, because I don't think that in the colour phi experiment you have an experience that's indistinguishable from an experience from real movement. And then you have to, I think all you see is one stimulus located at one location and one stimulus located at another location. And then, of course, there is something else to the experience of that, which is that nevertheless, even though on the one hand you see them as stationary, you also are aware of them in some sense as moving. And I think that's where an appeal to something like then being represented.
With your hand, it's the same, just seeing it in the different positions and at each time that it's moving. You can't say that these mechanisms are only working when we have an illusory experience. They're part of the veridical experience as well.
But what you're supposing here is a certain form of atomism, that the experience that goes on over time. Like this is something that David, for instance, would say, and that's what I'm kind of less sympathetic to what they say. That at each moment, that the reason why you see the thing moving at each moment in time has to be explained with what your experience is like just at that moment in time.
I'm not saying it has to, I say sort of
Yeah.
at least that aspect.
Yeah.
The other things are needed as well, and I need to be quiet. I really don't think I'm saying that. I just think it sort of can be in that.
Right, okay.
David, other David.
I'm very sympathetic to this view. I think there are lots of reasons for thinking that people like Laurie Hoerl write about this. And one is the difficulty of attributing content to perceptual experience in the first case, and how you go about doing it. One thing that strikes me about your story is you're going to say, and I think you're right, that what's going on here is there's an experience of succession rather than a sequence of experiences in states. Of course, they'll say, no, it's not. It's an experience directly in the flow and all the rest of it. Well, what on earth can settle that? Now, one thing it might settle that is, this is going to be crude, I don't really believe it, but the crude story is, it might be a crude externalist. So it might know what settles it is, roughly speaking, what causes it. it's caused by flow, it's an experience of flow. If it's caused by succession, it's an experience of succession. And then you're going to wonder, well, why are people going to attribute certain contents to their phenomenal experiences? Well, that depends on what they believe as the causing. So people who believe in flow are going to think that it's the experience of flow. And the people who believe in succession, like you and I perhaps, are going to think it's an experience of succession. Whether we're right depends on what's right in the evidence.
Yes. But as a matter of fact, that can't be with either or they nothing, because their argument is precisely that there isn't that thing out there, anything out there that could cause.
Oh no, I know that's not what they're thinking, but they're wrong about that.
Yeah.
So they've got the wrong story about what would give. They've got a theory of the content experience that tells you that you can pick the content experience sort of just introspectively.
Yeah.
It's not obviously right.
I agree.
Well, I thought there were two different issues that might need to be distinguished. On the one hand, there's this notion of motion, and we can ask whether this is just a kind of gradual, continuous change, or whether it perceives, or whether it consists of discrete steps. And this color phi experiment and this notion of animation, I think, has to do with the question of whether discrete sets of stimuli can be perceived as a continuous change. I mean, that's also, I mean, if you take animation literally in the sense of referring to cartoon movies, that's exactly what happens. But then on the other hand, there's this notion of the flow of time, which is a term, I think, which is usually meant to refer to the idea that there is something special about the present, the now, and its relation to the past and the future. And it's usually called flow because the sort of standard idea is that this is continuous motion. But it could very well be a discrete motion. It could be that time doesn't flow, but that it ticks, perhaps at Planck length. And so I think all this question about how we perceive motion doesn't answer very much whether there is a notion of something special to the present, because the question whether the motion is continuous or discontinuous is neutral with respect to the question whether there is something special about the now.
I think that's that. So I haven't really talked about any putative experience of the present or of the now, but just about arguments that say when you experience movement and change, you have an experience as of the passage. I think there was a shortcut in there where I did mention continuity. As a matter of fact, I don't think the kind of person who pushes the line that I'm pushing is committed to saying that we experience movement as continuous, because obviously the discontinuities, if there are any, are so small that we can't make them up. So I think a better way of describing the experience would be to say that you don't perceive the motion as being discontinuous, whereas you do perceive the motion as being discontinuous, for instance, in the case of colour phi, or when you just experience one thing happening and then another thing happening.
Thanks.
Does it help to deal with these people to try to undermine their feeling that they can interpret phenomenology naively, or that they have much privileged knowledge of the context of perceptual experience? So if you show them what's happening under the hood of their mind. So for example, with the motion, so some of those quotes, they talked about the motion after effect, and that, or sorry, the motion percepted as corresponding to change in position, but then we know there's the motion after effect where you can experience motion even with zero position change.
Yeah.
And so then, but if some of the philosopher didn't know about the motion after effect, then and some of them probably don't, they just go on saying motion equals position change.
I think
it helps to then show them that they can be wrong about, is that showing them that they...
Yeah, I think there's a general really big issue in the background which I haven't really touched upon, and I think that goes back to Nick's question as well, that how should we think of the relationship between kind of the psychological account of the mechanisms and so on, and the description on the level of phenomenology of the type that I've been using. And I'm just somebody who's incredibly wary of making any kind of level changes, swift level changes, up from, oh, this is what the computational story is, to this is what the phenomenology must be like. So
it seems a way to undermine their interpretation of the phenomenology to show them new cases of phenomenology, new illusions that then make them realize, oh, I was wrong to think about the phenomenology in this way, because now I can see, like position and motion can be teased apart.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's actually, that is quite an important point, that the impression of motion can be teased apart in certain cases, as I think it is actually in apparent motion from the impression of a locational variation. But and indeed, I think that's a good point to make against some of the construals here of the colourfied experiment, which is where people think what's happening is that the intermediate positions get filled in, and that's what explains why you have the illusion that I don't think that's what is happening on either the computational or the phenomenal level.
So yeah, this was originally going to be a question for Kia, but I was going to put it there, that relates to Alex's point and Nick's point. And it's, so I mean, even in the cases like Hedman was mentioning, where you can see the motion of the hourglass, and C.D. Broad was saying you can see the thing changing, not that it has changed. So there are, beyond my field of research, but there's an area known as V5 in the brain, which if you get this area damaged, you can take out these flowy kind of things. So they will perceive, for example, pouring a cup of tea as it has changed a certain amount, or you cross a road and the car position has changed a certain amount. So you can disrupt exactly this kind of thing that people think is a central part of phenomenology of flow and temporal perception. So I'm wondering if this is another example of showing them that they could be wrong about how well they know their own phenomenology.
Well, I think the interesting question is exactly how we should account for that. And again, this is an area where the neuroscientists will tell you one story, but then we also need to say, like, how should we describe the differences here on the level of phenomenology? And I think what I've been trying to give you here is actually a story that can deal with those sorts of cases. Because if there is such a thing as the species present, then the length of that is going to be a contingent feature of your experience, which of course it will depend on quite a lot of features of what's going on in your brain. And it might be that if you had a species presence which was quite a lot shorter than the one that we normally have, then of course even the second hand will not be seen to be moving, and like the coffee will not be seen to be pouring out of the pot.
Perfect.
Yeah, to a large extent, I think Jos and Carlo said what I would like to say, but let me just repeat it. If there's actually some very fundamental feature of reality that this so-called perception of passage is picking up on, then you would expect it to be present in essentially all experience. You wouldn't expect to see it in the phi color and not see it in the minute hand, but see it in the second hand. So therefore, I mean, the question we put to you, who's guilty of the bait and switch? Maybe by concentrating on that distinction, you're switching the question from what it should be. It may be that this perception is of something that we haven't yet correctly incorporated into our physical theory. And we won't be able to identify the cause, if you like, the underlying basis for it until physics advances.
I think I'm with you on that, but I think that there's more, then there's a bigger worry there. If it is an underlying feature of all reality, then we think that there are kind of causal explanations, for instance, for experience. Now, what's your causal story going to be there? It doesn't make, because it can't be a difference maker, as it were, because there couldn't be any possible experience. That goes back to the earlier question. There couldn't be any possible experience that lacked that feature. And I think it's really something actually that relates to, I had that question yesterday about the way that the discussion developed. It's like,
I think you're right. I think you're right. The word cause in the normal sense is not an adequate expression of this. But it may be, I mean, going back to Faye's comment the other day, it may be that everything that we're used to doing in science is analyzing the result of a process, whereas this perception is the perception that the process is actually occurring.
just, can I just make up that one point? I think the kinds of debates that touch on my area are debates where people start off from the datum that people talk of experiencing flow, experiencing passage, and so on and so forth. And I think in my area there's a certain kind of basic empiricism about those sorts of things going on that has somehow to be related to what they're experiencing. And I think that raises an issue as to what, for instance, the debates that we had yesterday morning, how that might connect with what people say about experiencing flow or experiencing passage, because those really subtle points about fundamental physics don't straightforwardly kind of project up into everyday experience so that we can explain how these could be the sources that make those people talk about experience having flow or passage level things.
George, last question to you.
Yeah, I find it very difficult to get to grips with this because you're talking about perception or having an experience or experiencing. The flow of time is embodied in the very concept of having an experience. It doesn't make sense to talk about having experience if time doesn't flow. And if it didn't flow, you would just have one image in your mind and you'd be stuck. You wouldn't be able to think about anything because you just have this one image sitting in your mind. And so it seems to me if time didn't flow, it wouldn't be possible to have an experience both phenomenologically and in terms of mechanisms, because the underlying mechanisms would also be stuck. So I just can't get my head around what the problem is.
Right, I think one of the things that seems to be going on here is that it's easy to think that if time doesn't flow, say, all you get is something like a cinematic or kind of pictures on a cinema reel.
But a cinema reel is a thing in which you get them one after the other. If time doesn't flow, you can't get them one after the other. It's not happening.
But that extends to a limited period of clock time. I mean, time under some description is still in there. It's just not conceived of as flow. So you still have.
Is it conceived of as passing?
No, not under reduction, anti-reductionist construal. It's simply an experience. I mean, that was the line I was pushing.
But then I don't understand how an experience is even possible.
Ask all of these patients with damaged 3-5 areas, and they'll tell you it always looks like it has happened, has changed. Not that it's changing now, but it's still an experience. Oh, it is only in vision, but there's an example where you could see it that it's possible, right? That it's an experience, or a visual experience, which doesn't have the property of flow. Sorry.
Okay, obviously there are lots of things that people still want to discuss here. So what I encourage you to do is to write them down on those pieces of paper and stick them on the wall. We can come back to them tomorrow. But for now, let's thank Christoph for a wonderful talk.